The Galactic Concord had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, they had never known true fear until the old archives were opened again. Ambassador Tyvan of the Valkyrie stood in the great library of the Concord, his silver eyes scanning the ancient data crystals that lined the walls like forgotten memories. He was searching for something that most believed did not exist anymore. "You waste your time," said Counselor Brax, a massive reptilian creature whose scales shimmered with irritation as he watched Tyvan work. "The humans are nothing but old stories told to frighten children." Tyvan did not respond immediately because he had found what he was looking for. Crystal that glowed with a faint blue light, untouched for 3,000 years. He lifted it carefully and placed it into the reading device. The hologram that appeared made both of them step back in surprise. It showed a planet of blue and green, swirling with white clouds and surrounded by a single large moon. The planet was beautiful in a way that seemed almost dangerous, like a predator sleeping in the sun. "Earth," Tyvan whispered, and the word felt strange on his tongue. "The Death World." The records began to play, and what they showed was difficult to believe. The planet called Earth was a place of extreme conditions where the temperature could shift from burning hot to freezing cold within a single rotation. Massive storms tore across its surface, while the ground itself would shake and split open without warning. And yet life had not only survived there, but had thrived in ways that made no sense to the Concord scientists. "Look at the gravity readings," Brax said, his voice now quiet with something that might have been awe or fear. "That world is nearly 3 times the pull of our homeworlds." The humans had evolved on this nightmare planet, and they had become something unique in all the galaxy. They were not the fastest species or the strongest or the smartest, but they were something far more terrifying. They were adaptable. The records showed humans living in frozen wastelands and burning deserts and dense jungles filled with creatures that could kill with a single bite. They showed humans diving into deep waters and climbing impossible mountains, and walking through places where the air itself was poison. And they showed humans fighting. Tyvan felt his telepathic senses recoil as the images of human warfare filled the chamber. These creatures had spent their entire existence battling each other with ever more creative methods of destruction. They had split the atom and burned entire cities. They had created weapons that could end all life on their planet, and then built even more. How did they not destroy themselves? Brax asked. "They almost did," Tyvan replied, scrolling through the records. "Many times. But somehow they always pulled back from the edge." The final records were the most mysterious of all. Approximately 3,000 years ago, the humans had achieved faster than light travel and had begun to spread into the stars. The Concord of that era had watched them with growing concern as these aggressive newcomers expanded rapidly, and then everything had stopped. The human colonies went silent one by one. Their ships vanished from the space lanes. Their transmissions ceased. Within a single generation, humanity had disappeared from the galaxy as if they had never existed. "The Great Silence," Tyvan said. "Our ancestors believed they had finally destroyed themselves." Brax made a sound of agreement. "And good riddance. Creatures like that have no place among civilized species." But Tyvan was not so certain. He had studied the records carefully, and something did not add up. The pattern of the human disappearance was too organized, too deliberate. It did not look like extinction. It looked like retreat. What if they did not die? Tyvan asked quietly. What if they chose to leave? Brax laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the library. And go where? We have mapped every corner of the galaxy. There is nowhere to hide. There is the void, Tyvan replied. The space between galaxies. We have never explored it because no species could survive there. The idea was absurd, and Tyvan knew it. The intergalactic void was empty and cold, and stretched for millions of light years. No civilization could exist in such a place, and yet the humans had come from a death world. They had thrived where no one else could. Was it really impossible that they had found a way to survive in the void? Tyven kept these thoughts to himself as he returned the crystal to its place. The Concord had decided long ago that humans were extinct, and no one wanted to question that comfortable belief. The 17 elder species of the Concord had built a perfect society over 12,000 years. They had eliminated war and suffering and want. They had created art and music and philosophy that spanned the stars. They had become so civilized that they had forgotten what it meant to fight for survival. Ambassador Tyven sometimes wondered if that was a good thing. He walked through the corridors of the Concord station, passing members of a dozen different species who nodded respectfully as he went by. The Velkari were known for their telepathic abilities and their calm wisdom, and Tyven had spent his entire life living up to that reputation. But tonight, as he returned to his quarters, he could not stop thinking about the humans. The old songs of his people spoke of the Terrans in whispers. They described a species that formed bonds with deadly predators and called them pets. They told of humans who lost limbs and continued fighting. They warned of a creature that could run for days without stopping, hunting its prey through sheer endurance. Persistence predators, Tyven murmured as he looked out at the stars. They did not need to be faster or stronger. They simply never gave up. His communicator chimed with a message from the High Council. Tomorrow there would be another meeting to discuss trade, routes and cultural exchanges, and all the comfortable business of a civilization that had forgotten Dangar. Tyven would attend. And he would smile, and he would play his part as a proper ambassador, but he would also keep searching the old records, because something in his mind whispered that the humans were not gone. Something told him that out there in the darkness between the stars, humanity was waiting. For what? He did not know. Perhaps they were healing from whatever had driven them away. Perhaps they were building something new. Perhaps they were simply watching, as predators do, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The galaxy had declared humans to be legends and myths and cautionary tales. Tyven hoped that the galaxy was right, because if it was wrong, if the humans were still out there, then everything the Concord believed about the universe was about to change. He turned off the lights and tried to sleep, but the image of that blue and green planet stayed with him through the night. Beautiful and terrible and full of creatures who had looked at a hostile universe and refused to surrender. The old songs were not finished. Tyven realized they were only waiting for the next verse. The warning came from the Outer Rim colonies on a morning that had seemed like any other. And by evening, the entire galaxy had changed forever. Ambassador Tyven was in the middle of a diplomatic reception when his communicator screamed with emergency signals. Around him, delegates from a dozen species reached for their own devices as the same terrible message spread through the Concord like fire through dry grass. "What is happening?" demanded Councillor Brax, his scales turning pale with alarm. The holographic display in the center of the room flickered to life, showing a star map that Tyven had memorized long ago. But now there were red marks spreading across the outer territories like a disease, each one representing a colony that had gone silent. "Unknown vessels have entered Concord space," announced the automated alert system. Numbers estimated at 200 million and increasing. The room fell silent as every being present tried to understand what they had just heard. 200 million ships was not an invasion fleet. It was an extinction event over the next 6 months. Tyven watched as the greatest civilization in galactic history crumbled like sand before the tide. The enemy came to be known as the Kethra Swarm, though no one knew if that was their real name or simply what the survivors called them. Before dying, the swarm was not like anything the Concord had ever faced. They were biological ships, living vessels that could heal from damage and reproduce in the depths of space. They did not negotiate or communicate or show any interest in anything except consumption. Every world they touched was stripped bare. Cities, forests, oceans, even the very minerals in the ground. All of it was devoured and converted into more swarm ships. The creatures left nothing behind but empty rock, floating in the void. High Admiral Cirith of the Dralox hegemony gathered the combined fleets of 17 species and met the swarm at the Battle of the Crimson Nebula. It was the largest military action in Concord history. With over 50,000 warships facing the enemy, the battle lasted less than 4 hours. Admiral Cirith survived only because his flagship was destroyed early and he was thrown clear in an escape pod. From that tiny vessel, he watched as the proud fleet of the Concord was torn apart by enemies that simply did not stop coming. For every one we destroyed, 10 more took its place, he reported to the council, his voice hollow with shock. Our weapons hurt them, yes, but they did not care. They felt no fear, no hesitation, no doubt. They simply kept attacking until we had nothing left. The council met in emergency session after emergency session, but there were no good options left. The Concord had spent 12,000 years perfecting diplomacy and trade and cultural exchange. They had not prepared for an enemy that could not be reasoned with. We must find allies, suggested Ambassador Tyven, though he knew how desperate the idea sounded. There must be someone in the galaxy who can help us fight. There is no one, Admiral Cirith replied bitterly. Every spacefaring species is already part of the Concord, or too primitive to be of use. We are alone, but Tyven could not accept that answer. He returned to the ancient library and searched through records that no one had touched in millennia. He looked for any mention of powerful species, forgotten empires, anyone who might have the strength to stand against the swarm, and once again, he found himself staring at the records of humanity. You are obsessed with ghosts, Brax told him when he discovered what Tyven was doing. The humans are dead and gone. They cannot save us, but what if they are not? Tyven asked. What if they are still out there, watching? Brax shook his head in frustration. Even if they were, why would they help us? The Concord treated them as savages and monsters. We celebrated when they disappeared. Do you think they have forgotten that? It was a fair point, and Tyven had no answer for it. The old records made it clear that the Concord of 3,000 years ago had viewed humans with fear and disgust. They had called them dangerous and unstable, and unfit for civilized society. Now the Concord needed exactly the kind of dangerous and unstable help that they had once rejected. Months passed and the situation grew worse. 42 colonies fell silent, then 60, then 100. The swarm moved steadily toward the core worlds where billions of Concord citizens lived in fear. Refugees flooded the remaining stations and planets, bringing with them stories of horror that kept Tyven awake at night. They spoke of worlds consumed in days, of families torn apart, of screaming that echoed across radio frequencies until suddenly there was only silence. We are going to lose, Admiral Cirith announced at what would prove to be the final council meeting. The mathematics are absolute. At our current rate of attrition, the Concord will cease to exist within 18 months. The delegates sat in stunned silence as the weight of those words settled over them. 12,000 years of civilization, art, music, philosophy, love, hope, dreams, all of it would be devoured by creatures that did not even understand what they were destroying. Then we must find another way, Tyven said, standing despite the despair that pressed down on him like a physical weight. We cannot give up. What would you have us do? Admiral Cirith asked, and for the first time, Tyven heard something like hope in his voice. A desperate wish that someone, anyone, might have an answer before Tyven could respond. Every sensor in the council chamber began to scream. Spatial anomaly detected, the computer announced. And there was something in its synthetic voice that sounded almost like surprise. Unknown energy signature. Location. The computer paused as if struggling to process what it was seeing. Location is directly between the Swarm Advance Fleet and the colony of New Verantis. The holographic display shifted to show the anomaly. And Tyven felt his heart stop. It was a tear in space itself. A wound in reality that pulsed with colors that had no name. It was growing larger with every second. And from its edges came something that made the ancient fear in Tyven's blood awaken energy readings that matched no known technology ship signatures numbering in the tens of thousands in the single transmission that cut through every frequency in the galaxy. Broadcast on wavelengths that the Concorde had not used in 3,000 years. Attention, unidentified vessels, the voice said. And Tyven realized with shock that it was speaking in standard galactic, but with an accent that belonged to a dead language. A tongue that no one had heard since the Great Silence. This is Fleet Admiral Yuki Tanaka of the United Human Sovereignty. The council chamber erupted in chaos, but Tyven stood frozen as the transmission continued. We have monitored your situation. We know what hunts you. And we have come to remind the galaxy why our ancestors were feared. The legends had returned, and they had brought a fleet. The human fleet emerged from the spatial tier like an army marching out of legend. And every being in the Concorde who watched would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. Ambassador Tyven stood before the viewing screen in the council chamber, his telepathic senses overwhelmed by the flood of emotions from the delegates around him. There was fear and hope and disbelief and 100 other feelings all mixed together into something that had no name. How many ships? Admiral Sirith asked, his voice barely a whisper. The sensor officer's hands trembled as she read the display. 53,000 confirmed and still counting. The anomaly has not closed yet. 53,000 warships was a force larger than the entire remaining Concorde fleet. But it was not just the numbers that made Tyven's blood run cold. It was the ships themselves. They were nothing like the elegant vessels of the Concorde. Where Concorde ships were smooth and graceful and built for beauty as much as function, the human ships were brutal and angular and covered in weapons. They looked like predators, like creatures designed for one purpose, only war. They are hailing us, the communications officer announced, and Tyven could hear the fear in her voice. All frequencies. They want everyone to hear. Open the channel. Admiral Sirith commanded. The holographic display shifted to show a face that Tyven had only seen in ancient records, a human face. With brown skin and dark eyes and black hair pulled back severely. She wore a uniform of deep blue decorated with medals and symbols that Tyven did not recognize. This is Fleet Admiral Yuki Tanaka, she said, and her voice was calm in a way that somehow made it more terrifying. I addressed the Galactic Concorde. The council chamber was silent. No one dared to breathe. 3,000 years ago, my ancestors left this galaxy, Admiral Tanaka continued. They left because they were tired of being called monsters by species who had never known true struggle. They left because the Concorde made it clear that humanity was not welcome among the stars. She paused, and something flickered in her eyes, an emotion that Tyven tried to read but could not quite identify. We built a new home in the void between galaxies. We survived conditions that should have killed us. We grew stronger and smarter and more unified than we had ever been. And we watched. The holographic display split to show images that made Tyven's heart clench. Images of Concorde worlds being consumed by the swarm, of refugees fleeing in terror, of children crying for parents who would never come back. We watched as the species who rejected us faced an enemy they could not defeat, Admiral Tanaka said. We watched as your civilization began to crumble. We watched as you searched your archives for any hope of salvation. She smiled then, and it was not a friendly expression. It was the smile of a predator who had finally decided to reveal itself. You found old records of humanity and called us legends. You called us myths. You called us extinct. But here is the truth that your ancestors were too afraid to record. We are none of those things. The human fleet began to move, spreading out in formations that the Concorde's tactical computers could not predict. They moved with a coordination that should have been impossible for non-telepathic beings, as if each ship knew exactly where it needed to be. We are the children of a death world, Admiral Tanaka continued. We evolved to survive the impossible. We learned to fight when fighting was all that kept us alive. We carry war in our blood and fire in our hearts. Tyven reached out with his telepathic senses, trying to read the Admiral's mind across the vast distance between them. What he found made him gasp and stumble backward. Her mind was not quiet like the minds of the Concorde species. It was a storm of thought and emotion and calculation, all of it burning with an intensity that hurt to touch. There was rage in there, ancient and deep, but there was also something else, something that felt like fierce, protective love. The Concorde rejected us because you feared what we were, Admiral Tanaka said. And you were right to fear. We are dangerous in ways that you cannot imagine. She leaned forward, and her eyes seemed to look directly at Tyven through the screen. But we are also something else. We are loyal to those we call friend. We protect those we call family. We will walk through fire and death and darkness for anyone who earns our love. The human fleet had finished its deployment now, forming a wall of ships between the Concorde's remaining territories and the advancing swarm. Tyven counted battleships and carriers and vessels whose purpose he could not guess, all of them bristling with weapons that made the Concorde's best look like toys. You did not earn our love, Admiral Tanaka admitted. Your ancestors treated mine with contempt and fear. But the people dying on your colonies now are not the ones who made that choice. The children crying for help did nothing wrong. Her voice softened just slightly. We came back because we heard them crying. We came back because that is what humans do. We cannot turn away from those who need us, even when they do not deserve our help. Admiral Sirith found his voice at last. What do you want from us? Admiral Tanaka's smile changed, becoming something almost warm. We want nothing except what any warrior wants: a good fight and people worth protecting. The swarm has given us the first. The Concorde can give us the second. And if we refuse your help? Admiral Sirith asked, though his voice made it clear that refusing was the last thing on his mind. Then we will fight the swarm anyway. Admiral Tanaka replied simply. We did not travel 3,000 light years to turn back now. But it would be easier with allies who know the local space. She paused, and for a moment she looked almost uncertain. We ask only one thing in return for our help. Name it, Tyven said. Speaking before he could stop himself, Admiral Tanaka looked at him with those dark predator eyes. Remember us. Not as the monsters your ancestors feared, but as we truly are. Tell a story of what happens here today, and make sure it is told honestly. Tyven bowed his head in the Volcari gesture of acceptance. It will be done. Then we have an agreement, Admiral Tanaka said, and her smile returned. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a swarm to destroy. The transmission ended. And for a long moment, no one in the council chamber spoke. Then the censor officer's voice broke the silence. Trembling with something between terror and awe, the swarm advance fleet has engaged the human forces. Total enemy count is 300 million bioships. 300 million against 53,000. The mathematics were clear. The humans were outnumbered nearly 6,000 to 1, but as Tyven watched the battle begin, he realized that mathematics meant nothing to a species that had spent its entire existence defying impossible odds. The legends had returned, and they had come to fight. The Battle of Varantis would be studied by military scholars for thousands of years, and none of them would ever fully understand what they witnessed that day. Ambassador Tyven stood in the observation deck of the Concorde flagship, watching the sensor displays with a mixture of horror and fascination as the human fleet met the swarm. Beside him, Admiral Cirith kept muttering calculations under his breath, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "This is impossible," the Admiral said for perhaps the 100th time. "Their tactics make no sense. The Concorde way of war was simple and logical. You formed defensive lines, concentrated fire on enemy weak points, and retreated when casualties became too high. Every species in the Concorde fought this way because it was the only rational approach. The humans did not fight this way. Instead of forming defensive lines, the human fleet had split into thousands of smaller groups that swept through the swarm like wolves through a flock of sheep. They attacked from every direction at once, never staying in one place long enough to be surrounded, always moving to where the enemy was weakest. They are treating this like a hunt," Tyven realized suddenly. "They are not trying to hold territory, they are trying to kill." The difference was profound. The Concorde fought to protect and preserve, which meant they could be worn down by an enemy that did not care about losses. The humans fought to destroy, which meant they could keep attacking as long as there were enemies left to kill, and the humans were very good at killing. Tyven watched as a human destroyer group encountered a swarm formation 10 times their size. Instead of retreating, the destroyers accelerated directly into the enemy, their weapons firing continuously as they wove through the bioships like dancers at a ball. Half the destroyers were lost, but the swarm formation was annihilated. They sacrificed themselves. Admiral Cirith whispered. "No," Tyven corrected him. "They accepted the cost." There is a difference. The humans seemed to understand something that the Concorde had forgotten, that sometimes victory required sacrifice, that protecting the ones you loved might mean dying for them. The Concorde had spent 12,000 years trying to eliminate risk and danger, and in doing so, they had lost the ability to face it. The transmission crackled, and Admiral Tanaka's voice filled the observation deck. "Concorde flagship, this is the remembrance. We are detecting a swarm hive ship moving toward your position. Recommend you withdraw at a safe distance." "Negative," Admiral Cirith replied, surprising everyone, including himself. "We will hold position and provide support fire." There was a pause, and when Admiral Tanaka spoke again, there was something warm in her voice. "Understood, Concorde flagship. It seems there is some fight left in you after all." The hive ship was enormous, a living mountain of flesh and chitin that dwarfed even the human dreadnoughts. It was the command center of the local swarm fleet, and destroying it would throw the enemy into disarray, and human battleships peeled away from the main fleet and moved to intercept the hive ship. Tyven watched their approach with growing dread as he realized what they intended to do. "They are going to ram it," he said. "They are going to sacrifice 10 battleships to destroy one target." But the humans had other plans as the battleships approached the hive ship. Their hulls began to open like flowers blooming in the void. Thousands of small craft poured out, dropships and gunships and things that Tyven had no name for, all of them heading straight for the hive ship's surface. "They are boarding it," Admiral Cirith said, his voice filled with disbelief. "They are actually boarding a swarm hive ship." The very idea was insane. The interior of a hive ship was a maze of organic tunnels filled with swarm drones that would tear any intruder apart. No Concorde soldier would ever attempt such a thing, but the humans were not Concorde soldiers. Tyven reached out with his telepathic senses, trying to touch the minds of the human warriors as they breached the hive ship's outer membrane. What he found made him cry out in shock and fall to his knees. The human minds were not calm or focused or disciplined in any way that Tyven understood. They were wild and fierce and burning with emotions so intense that they were physically painful to feel. There was fear in those minds. Yes, the humans were not stupid enough to ignore danger, but the fear was wrapped in something stronger joy. The humans were enjoying themselves. How is that possible? Tyvan gasped. They are fighting for their lives and they are happy? Admiral Sirith helped him to his feet, his reptilian face showing as much confusion as Tyvan felt. What did you see? They love this, Tyvan said. Not the killing. I do not think they love that, but the struggle, the challenge, the feeling of testing themselves against a worthy opponent. They have waited 3,000 years for a fight like this, and they are savoring every moment. Inside the hive ship, the human marines carved through swarm drones with weapons that Tyvan had never seen before. Guns that fired solid projectiles. Blades that hummed with energy, even their armored fists and feet. They moved in coordinated teams that covered each other's weaknesses and exploited. Every opening one marine took a wound that would have killed any Concord soldier. A swarm drone's claw punched straight through her chest armor, but she kept fighting. Her face twisted in a snarl of defiance as she emptied her weapon into the enemy before finally falling her. Squadmates did not stop to mourn. They stepped over her body and kept pushing forward, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. They would grieve later, Tyvan realized. Right now they had a job to do for 7 minutes after the boarding action began. The hive ship exploded. The blast was visible across the entire battlefield. A flower of fire that consumed billions of swarm drones and turned the tide of the battle. The remaining swarm forces fell into chaos without the hive ship's guiding intelligence. And the human fleet fell upon them like wolves upon wounded prey by the time it was over. 300 million swarm bioships had been reduced to debris. The human fleet had lost nearly 40% of its strength. But they had won a victory that should have been impossible. Admiral Tanaka's face appeared on the view screen, and Tyvan was shocked to see tears running down her cheeks. Concord flagship, please confirm that the civilian evacuation from Verantis is complete. Confirmed, Admiral Sirith replied. 3 million refugees safely away. You saved them all. Admiral Tanaka closed her eyes for a moment. Good. That is good. You are crying, Tyvan said. Why? The human admiral opened her eyes and looked at him. Because we lost 18,000 ships today. Because each of those ships had a crew of people who will never go home. Because I ordered them to their deaths and they went willingly. Then why did you do it? Admiral Sirith asked. Admiral Tanaka smiled through her tears. Because 3 million innocent people would have died if we did not. Because protecting the helpless is worth any price. Because that is what it means to be human. Tyvan finally understood what he had sensed in the human minds. It was not bloodlust or aggression or any of the things that the old Concord records had claimed. It was love, a fierce and protective love that would burn down the galaxy to keep the innocent safe. The humans were not monsters. They were guardians, and the galaxy had been very wrong about them. 6 months after the Battle of Verantis, the Kethra swarm was driven beyond the edge of the galaxy and into the cold dark void from which they had come. The survivors carried a new instinct burned into their hive mind, a terror so deep that it would shape their species for 1 million years. Avoid the bipeds. Avoid the Deathworlders. Avoid the humans. Ambassador Tyvan stood in the rebuilt council chamber, surrounded by delegates from 17 elder species who had gathered to witness something that none of them had ever expected, the formal admission of humanity. Into the Galactic Concord, the chamber was filled to capacity, with observers packed into every available space. Beings who had never shown interest in politics had traveled from across the galaxy to see the legendary humans in person. Children pressed against viewing screens while their parents whispered stories of the war admiral. Yuki Tanaka entered through the main doors, flanked by 2 human marines in ceremonial armor. She wore the same blue uniform that Tyven remembered from their first meeting, but there were new medals on her chest and new lines on her face. The war had cost her greatly, and it showed. The Council recognizes Fleet Admiral Yuki Tanaka of the United Human Sovereignty, the Speaker announced. The Admiral may address the Assembly. Admiral Tanaka walked to the center of the chamber and stood beneath the great dome that showed the stars of the galaxy stars that were now safe because of her peoples. Sacrifice honored delegates, she began, and her voice was softer than Tyven remembered. I stand before you as a representative of humanity, but also as a soldier who has seen too much death. I have things to say that may not be comfortable to hear. The chamber fell silent. 3,000 years ago, my ancestors left this galaxy because they were rejected by yours. They were called dangerous and savage and unfit for civilized company. Your records describe them as monsters who communicated by vibrating air molecules and formed bonds with deadly predators. Admiral Tanaka paused and looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates from each species in turn. Your ancestors were not entirely wrong. We are dangerous. We are capable of violence that would shock any species in this room. We carry the echoes of 1,000,000 years of warfare in our genes, and we will never be truly peaceful. A murmur ran through the assembly, and Tyven sensed fear rising in many minds. But Admiral Tanaka raised her hand for silence. But here's what your ancestors did not understand. Our violence is not mindless. Our aggression is not uncontrolled. Every horror that humanity has ever committed was matched by acts of kindness and courage and self-sacrifice that are just as much a part of our nature. She gestured to the Marines beside her, and one of them stepped forward. It was a young woman with pale skin and red hair, and Tyven recognized her from the sensor records. She was one of the Marines who had boarded the hive ship at Varantis. This is Corporal Sarah Chun, Admiral Tanaka said. During the boarding action, she took a wound that should have killed her instantly. A swarm claw pierced her lung and her heart was failing. Any rational being would have stopped fighting and called for medical aid. Corporal Chun stood at attention, her face showing no emotion. Instead, she kept fighting for another 3 minutes. She killed 17 swarm drones with her bare hands while her heart was literally dying in her chest. When her squad mates finally reached her, she was still trying to reload her weapon. Admiral Tanaka turned back to the assembly. When I asked her why she did it, do you know what she said? The chamber was utterly silent. She said that her squad needed those 3 minutes to reach the hive ship's core. She said that if she had stopped fighting, her friends would have died. She said that her own life was a small price to pay. Admiral Tanaka's voice grew stronger. That is humanity. We are not just creatures of violence. We are creatures of love so fierce that we will tear ourselves apart to protect those we care about. We will walk through fire and pain and death for people we have never met simply because they needed help. She looked at Tyven then, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. The Concord asked us why we came back. You assumed it was for revenge or conquest or some other dark purpose. But the truth is much simpler. We heard you crying for help, and we could not ignore that cry. Admiral Tanaka took a deep breath. I have a request to make of this council. Not a demand, not a condition of our alliance, just a simple request from one species to another. The speaker leaned forward. Name your request, Admiral. Tell our story honestly, Admiral Tanaka said. Do not make us into heroes or villains or anything except what we truly are. Show your children the good and the bad, the violence and the kindness, the fury and the love. Let them decide for themselves what to think of humanity. Why does this matter to you? Councillor Brax asked from his seat. Admiral Tanaka smiled, and this time it was a real smile, warm and gentle. Because we have spent 3,000 years alone in the dark. We have no one to share our stories with except ourselves. We want to be known, not as legends or myths, but as people. Tyven rose from his seat and walked to stand before the Admiral. The gesture was unprecedented. Ambassadors did not leave their positions during formal sessions, but Tyven no longer cared about protocol. I have studied your species since before the war began, he said. I have read your records and touched your minds and watched you fight and die. And I have one question that has haunted me through all of it. Ask, Admiral Tanaka replied. Why do you care so much? Tyven asked. You barely knew us. We had done nothing to earn your loyalty. Yet you sacrificed millions of your people to save us. Why? Admiral Tanaka was quiet for a long moment. There is a word in one of our old languages, Ubuntu. It means that a person is a person because of other people. We believe that all thinking beings are connected, that your suffering is our suffering, that your joy is our joy. She reached out and took Tyven's hand, a gesture of trust that made the entire chamber gasp. We came back because the universe is large and cold and empty, and no one should have to face it alone. We came back because the same fire that makes us dangerous also makes us need to protect. We came back because that is what family does. Tyven felt tears forming in his eyes, an emotion that Valkyrie rarely displayed in public. Then let me be the first to welcome you home, Admiral. Your exile is over. The chamber erupted in applause, a sound that built and built until it shook the very walls. Beings of every species rose to their feet and added their voices to the celebration. 3,000 years of fear and misunderstanding washed away in a single moment of connection. Admiral Tanaka squeezed Tyven's hand. The old songs were wrong about us. No, Tyven replied, echoing words that he had thought to himself long ago. The old songs were not wrong. They were simply not finished yet. In the years that followed, humanity took its place among the stars as full members of the Galactic Concord. They brought with them technology and art and music that enriched every species they encountered. They formed bonds with beings of every kind, adopting them into their vast and ever-growing family, and they kept their promise when danger threatened. Humans were always the first to respond. When someone needed help, humans were always there. When the universe seemed cold and uncaring, humans reminded everyone that there was still warmth and love and hope in the darkness. The legends had become reality, and the reality was far better than anyone had ever imagined. On the anniversary of the Battle of Varanus, a new tradition began. Across the galaxy, beings of every species would gather together and share stories of humanity, tales of courage and kindness, of sacrifice and love, of a species that had looked at a hostile universe and refused to surrender. Tyven attended every one of these gatherings until his final days. And he always told the same story, the story of a day when the legends returned to save a galaxy that did not deserve saving, and at the end of his tale, he would smile and repeat the words that Admiral Tanaka had spoken so long ago. That is humanity. We are your legends. We are your nightmares. And now and forever, we are your friends. The old songs were finally complete, and the new songs had only just begun.